Thank you, Marco. Ladies and gentlemen, do what thou wilt to do the whole of the law. I'm happy to be here with all of you today. I'm only sorry that I can't see all of your happy faces like I do when I lecture live, but we do what we must. I'm here today to discuss a historical object that has become an icon of Thelema. I would say it was a well-known icon, but that would not be completely true. It's certainly a familiar icon and a recognizable icon to most Thelemites. But I found that most people, I'm sorry, you say something, Marco?
No, I'm muted.
Okay. But I found that most people really don't know much about this object other than the basic story of how it came to Aleister Crowley's attention. And some do not even realize that paraphrases of some of it were utilized in the Book of the Law. At the outset, I want you to note that the word Stèle is written in the Book of the Law this way, with acute accents over both vowels. Correct usage is written with a grave accent over the first vowel, Stèle, with no accents. My spelling here is not an attempt to correct the Book of the Law. Herein, I'm just following what's standard correct usage in spelling. The precedent for this comes from the original French translation for Crowley that was done by Georges Darasset. Secondly, you will note that I use the spelling Ankh Effen Konsu, not Ankh Othma Konsu, as it appears in the Book of the Law. This is because I'll be discussing the text of this stela primarily as an Egyptologist, and I will be using scholastic terminology. The stela we're talking about is that Egyptian. Hold on a second. I'm going to close my window. I think a lawnmower just showed up in my yard. Yeah, if you don't mind. So our lawnmower showed up. He's going to drown me out unless Gwen tells him to come back at another day. Now, where was I? The stela that we're talking about is that Egyptian relic that's now held in the Cairo Museum, and it has registration A9422. This is a photograph of the front. It's a late period funerary stela of a Theban priest named Ankhepen Khonsu. Modern Egyptologists call him Ankhepen Khonsu the First, because there are numerous individuals with that name in Egyptian history. Despite the fact that he's called the first, he was not the first man historically to bear that name. There were others before him and others after him. He was just the first one whose life was critically examined and thus came to be the first one known. Some Egyptologists say Ankhepen Khans instead of Ankhepen Khonsu, but I'm not one of them. Those of us who accept the law of Thelema usually call him Ankhepen Khonsu, since that is his name, as it occurs in our most sacred document, the Book of the Law. You can recognize an image of the original stela from the two holes in the top center. I'll discuss this curious fact a little bit later. Now, this slide was made from a photograph of the original in the Cairo Museum. It's not a copy. As I mentioned before, much of the history of this stela and the contents of its text are not well known to most people. Today, I hope to fill in some of the gaps in this story. Together, we'll briefly examine that stela and what it signified and what its purpose was. We'll investigate the story of the man Ankhepen Khonsu himself, and finally his family. Who was he? And what does it matter to us today? And therefore, we will be discussing the content of the text of the stela based on my new translation of the Egyptian hieroglyphics. I hope some of you will find it interesting. This is a pretty long lecture, so I will try to move it right along. We will have a break in the middle to give you a chance to stretch your legs. My colleague, H.B. Frater Superior OTO, has said that, and I quote, The importance of Ankh and Khonsu, the first to the holy books of Thelema, cannot easily be overstated. It is not an exaggeration to say that they begin and end with him. The lead up to the reception of Liber Legis, the first of the holy books, centered on his stela and its translation, parts of which made their way into the text in versified form. This stela dates to approximately 680 to 670 BCE, which falls between the late 25th dynasty and early 26th dynasty. As of this current year, it's almost 2,700 years old. Based on the account of French Egyptologist Auguste Mariette, it was originally discovered in 1858 EV, along with numerous sarcophagi, coffins, and funerary artifacts of Theban priests of the late period of Egypt. The site of the discovery was somewhere near the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari in Egypt. Unfortunately, there's no evidence for the excavation of Theban priest burials in 1858, other than one statement by Mariette himself. Even then, Mariette stated only that at the time, the area was cleared of debris. But as best we can tell from existing sources, the actual excavation of that site did not occur until 1862 and later in 1866 with the work of Italian Egyptologist Luigi Vassalli. The details of the excavation that unearthed these burials is unfortunately quite vague. In fact, the exact location remains in dispute today, and authorities cannot agree to the indistinct evidence. Vassalli's only reference to the location stated that the excavation took place outside the Temple of Hatshepsut. Vassalli's field notes for the excavation of 1866 are not extant. To complicate things even more, most of Mariette's notes were lost in a subsequent flood. What do we know for certain is that the stela was included among the funerary remains of a group of priests of Menthu, including the sarcophagus and coffin of Ankh and Khonsu himself, and included the coffins of his sons, Nestor-Amen II, Winifred II, and Besenmut II, as well as other descendants. After its discovery, the stela was moved to the Bulak Museum. Then, for a time, it disappeared from view and from the records of the artifacts of the museum. For example, it is not listed in the 1868 catalog published by the Bulak Museum where it was. At some point, it was assigned the inventory number 666. In 1871, Danish Egyptologist Jens Liebland examined all the holdings in the Bulak Museum while compiling his famous Dictionary of Personal Names in hieroglyphic inscriptions, a dictionary which is still used by Egyptologists today. I frequently use it myself in my Egyptological work. Liebland even examined the artifacts that were not on display and in storerooms. Names from the coffins discovered at Deir el-Bahari are contained in that dictionary with their sources, but no names sourced from the stela of Ankh and Khonsu are included in that book. He published a supplement to this dictionary in 1891, but once again, the names on the stela of Ankh and Khonsu are not included. Liebland was a skillful Egyptologist, and he was very thorough in his work. In the light of this evidence, it is probable that during this time, the stela was on loan to another museum or it was stored off-site. Had it been available, Liebland would have recorded it. However, we know it was there and on display prior to 1872, the date of Mariette's book of museum photographs, Album des Musées de Bulak. Mariette highlighted the stela in plates 14 and plate 15 of that book. Of particular interest is that in both of these plates, he chose to display the reverse side of the stela, not the colorful front. One of these reasons may be linked to the content of the reverse side, which I will discuss later. This slide is from plate 14 in the Album des Musées de Bulak. As you can see, the stelae revealing of Ankh and Khonsu is displayed prominently, but showing the reverse side rather than the front. Marriott chose to display the front of another offering stela, one from the 22nd dynasty, that of the Lady Jed Amun Yu Ankh. Marriott and subsequent curators of the museum seem to have been quite fond of this stela as well, as it is a very colorful example of a funerary stela, and it has been displayed prominently. This is plate 15 in the Album de Musée du Bulak. It's a museum display intended to imitate the cluttered look of a cache of grave goods in an Egyptian tomb. All of the items in this photograph belong to members of the family of Ankh and Khonsu. The large box-shaped sarcophagus with rounded lid is that of Ankh and Khonsu himself, which had contained two interlocking coffins with his mummy in the latter one. In the front of the sarcophagus, leaning on a canopic jar chest, you can see the stela of Ankh and Khonsu, again positioned to show its reverse side rather than the obverse. And by the time of this photograph, his mummy had already been removed from the coffin, and the coffin separated from the sarcophagus. Now, in this photograph, you can't get a good look of how the sarcophagus is constructed. Here's an example of an identical sarcophagus with interlocking inner coffins of a Theban priest from the same period. Unfortunately, it's not that of Ankh and Khonsu, as we do not possess color photographs of it, even though it's safely in the Cairo Museum. Perhaps one day the curators of the Cairo Museum will do what many of the great museums in the world are doing now, which is putting free quality photographs of their holdings on the internet. But until that time, I must be content to show you this photograph and tell you that the construction and symbolism of Ankh and Khonsu's burial ensemble is identical to the one that you're looking at now. The round-top sarcophagus lid is surmounted at the foot by a crouching figure of Anubis. In the center is a small shabti box with a crouching falcon on the lid. The bottom of the sarcophagus has 4 falcons, one mounted upon each corner post. These represent the 4 children of Horus. 2 interlocking coffins are placed inside the sarcophagus, with the mummy occupying the third and innermost coffin. These coffins are inscribed with a host of spells from the Book of the Dead and other funerary texts. As I said, this example funeral assemblage is identical to that of Ankh and Khonsu, except for one very important thing. The innermost coffin of Ankh and Khonsu shows his hands crossed across his breast, a most unusual stylistic element for the time, representing what can only be described as an archaism, reflecting a style from much older dynasties. Archaeologists have noted how this coffin is quite unusual. But now, let's talk about the stela revealing the stela of Ankh and Khonsu and its importance to Thelema. How a funerary artifact from the 26th Egyptian dynasty became the touchstone of a new eon. On August 12, 1903 EV, Aleister Crowley married Rose Edith Kelly, the beautiful sister of his artist friend Gerald Kelly. At that time, Crowley was living in his house at the Leskin House on Loch Ness. Since winter was just around the corner, Crowley decided Rose deserved a honeymoon grander than any quaint town of Scotland could offer, so he planned a cosmopolitan adventure that carried them to Egypt. Very early in 1904 EV, Crowley and his bride arrived in Cairo. Deciding to remain in Cairo to avoid the cold Scottish weather, they rented a flat in Cairo on March the 14th, near the Cairo Museum in the Egyptian quarter of Cairo, the European quarter of Cairo, registering as Prince Haiwa Khan and his Princess Warda, by translation, Master Beast and Rose. Crowley as Haiwa Khan enjoyed the playful masquerade, going around the streets and restaurants of Cairo with his pearl meerschaum pipe clenched in his teeth, sporting a scarlet fez and flowing white coat with a red sash. while Warda adorned herself in flowing, elegant evening gowns. In their rented flat, Crowley converted one of the rooms into a magical temple, and in order to impress Rose, he began to evoke to visible appearance the sylphs, the elemental spirits of the air. A couple of days later, while Crowley was performing his conjuration, Rose fell into a strange state and began muttering, "They're waiting for you. It's all about the child, all of Cyrus." Crowley was annoyed, and he thought she was either hungover or had morning sickness. On the third day of his conjuration, the same thing happened again. This time, Rose muttered, "The one who waits is Horus." That got Crowley's attention. Since Rose did not know the first thing about Egyptian mythology, Crowley was skeptical, and he tested her by asking questions about the god, questions that he was certain she did not know. She answered them all correctly. As a final test, he took Rose to a nearby museum and asked her to point out the god to him. Now here the story gets a bit muddled. If one follows Crowley's account in his autobiography, there he says they went to the Bulak Museum, where Rose led him to the Stèle of Akaf and Khonsu. Remember, this took place in March of 1904 EV. The problem with Crowley's story is that at that time, the Stèle was no longer in the Bulak Museum. It had been moved to the Cairo Museum 2 years earlier. Crowley's notes from that time period are very sketchy, and his memory was not much better. We know from documented evidence that the Stèle was not where Crowley said it was. It was in the Cairo Museum. Regardless, Crowley said that they had not previously visited the museum where the Stèle was found. That much we know is correct. When they entered the museum, they strolled past many Egyptian artifacts, and they passed many images of the god Horus without so much as a twitch from Rose. Crowley smiled. He was convinced that she was delusional or just being theatric. Without uttering a word, she led him upstairs to another room filled with Egyptian artifacts. Rose stopped and pointed to a glass display on the other side of the room. She muttered dreamily, "They're waiting for you. It's all about the child." Crowley couldn't make out any details from that distance, so they moved closer. In front of the glass case, she again pointed and declared, "There he is." It was the 26th dynasty funerary stele of a Theban priest named Akaf and Khonsu, with the special form of the god Horus depicted on the front, Ra-Horakti, or as we call him, Ra-Horakut. Crowley was astonished to see its museum catalog number. It was 666. This was a number of special and profound magical significance to him. Rose had not only found Horus, but she had found him marked with the number of the beast. It was the beginning of the revelation destined to change his life forever. He would later call it the advent of the Aeon of Horus, and he came to call this Egyptian artifact the Stèle of Revealing. From an Egyptological point of view, this is a very interesting stele because it is an unusual example. For one thing, as I mentioned, it's inscribed on both sides. The majority of funerary steles are inscribed on the front only. Secondly, the reverse is inscribed with Book of the Dead spell 30, a heart spell. This is unusual because that spell was normally inscribed on scarabs placed over the heart of the mummy. It is even more intriguing because during the late 25th and throughout the 26th dynasty, the Book of the Dead, spell 30, and a variant, heart spell 30b, were combined for the very first time, and they began to occur regularly on coffins. Why is that intriguing? Because the earliest example we know of that configuration is found on the coffin of Akaf and Khonsu himself. It is also found on the external sarcophagus that housed his coffin. Now just think about this for a moment. spell from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, always found on heart scarabs and placed over the heart of a mummy, remarkably is found inscribed on the funerary stela of Ankh and Khonsu, and it is also found for the first time in recorded history on a coffin and a sarcophagus. His coffin, his sarcophagus. Naturally, I find that very curious. Most Egyptologists believe, from internal evidence, that Ankh and Khonsu himself probably selected all the inscriptions for his stela, his sarcophagus, and his coffin as well. So what was it about spell 30 that inspired him to request that it be inscribed on his funerary stela as well as his coffin? And further, immediately following spell 30 on his stela is another spell from the Book of the Dead, spell number 2. It's entitled A Spell for Going Out in the Day and Living After Dying. Is there some significance in that choice as well? Perhaps today we can discover the answer to these questions and more. Just maybe we can part the curtains of time and look into the mysterious past and grasp a glimpse of a holy man who lived over 2,600 years ago, but who reached across the gulf of years to shape the foundations of our spiritual world only 117 years ago. To begin our quest to understand what the stellar revealing is and what it contains, what it was created for, it is necessary to first acquaint ourselves with the man for whom it was created, Ankh and Khonsu. Who was he? And perhaps if we dare to reach beyond documented history and look into the shadowed mysteries, we can ask, who is he? We discover that Ankh and Khonsu was a prominent figure in the history of the priests of Thebes in the late 25th and 26th dynasties. He was born into a very prominent family in Thebes. His father is considered the patriarch of a highly influential line of priests that left an indelible mark in the history of this period. His name is shown here, written in hieroglyphics. Now, in his introduction to the Confessions of Aleister Crowley, John Simmons wrote that his name, quote, meant, his life is in Khonsu, end quote. That is incorrect. I should like to make haste here and digress just a minute and tell you that on Wikipedia, there's an article entitled Ankh and Khonsu the First, and there's a quotation from an article published in 2002 written by a person named Lutea, L-U-T-E-A. That was entitled, Who and What Are Those Egyptian References in Liber Resh? That purports to explain the name of Ankh and Khonsu. It's not only incorrect, it's absolute rubbish. It's not based on sound Egyptology, but only on wild speculations conjured out of imagination and explanations of the hieroglyphs that are sheer nonsense. It's a great example of the old adage, if the blind lead the blind, they both fall into the ditch. So I would urge all of you to ignore that Wikipedia article on the stela until somebody deletes this nonsense. Now back to our hieroglyphics. In the language of Egypt, his name meant he lives for Khonsu. The archaic Egyptian language was a verbal language, sometimes and typically began with a verb. The word Ankh is the verb live, with the personal pronoun suffix f, meaning he. That is, Ankh, he lives. The next component of his name is the preposition an, which means for. The last phonetic portion of his name is that of a god, Khonsu. And the final character of his name is written here. It's an ideogram. It has no phonetic value. This type of character is called a determinative because it determines or is intended to clarify the meaning of the word. Here, it's the ideogram of a man seated on a throne-like chair. This is one of the determinatives used to indicate an honored deceased man. It's similar to the phrase we use today, the dearly departed. His name is a dedicatory declaration. He lives for Khonsu. As I said before, Egyptologists refer to him as Occupant Khonsu I, but he was not the first to bear that name. There were others before him and others after him, but he was probably the most significant historical figure to bear that name. Our natural curiosity compels us to ask, what did he look like, this Occupant Khonsu? Well, we have the two interlocking coffin lids in the Cairo Museum, both of which bear his likeness. The exterior lid is number 41.043, has a very clear, stark portrayal of his face. The interior lid, museum number 41.042, also has a good image. Unfortunately, it's marred by the loss of one of the inset eyes. Both representations of his face show a curious, faint smile at the corner of his lips. But this is not unique to him, as all of the coffins of his sons, for example, show the same feature. This little portrait is from one end of his external sarcophagus. It's somewhat disfigured by aging, and unfortunately, this picture is not in color, but it's the best that we can obtain at this time from the Cairo Museum. As you can see, the posture is identical to that of the Stèle. The altar and the inscriptions beneath it are also identical. Here, he's missing the shoulder sash with the leopard head clasp. The leopard tail hangs between his legs rather than at the back, as on the Stèle. There's also the block statue in the Cairo Museum, which is inscribed with the name Occupant Khonsu, and it has been identified as belonging to Occupant Khonsu I. However, I think you will notice a profound difference in the features on this statue. It looks nothing like the portraits on his coffins. Due to the vast differences in appearance, as well as its provenance, we do not believe that this statue was actually carved for Occupant Khonsu. It was most likely made for someone else much earlier, and that it was appropriated for him after his death by inscribing it with the appropriate hieroglyphics. And this was a fairly common practice. Lastly, we have a slide of a wooden statuette of Occupant Khonsu that's in, of all places, in the Macclesfield Silk Museum in England. It's a little wooden figure that's only 7 centimeters tall, or about 2 3/4 inches. The head is depicted bald, except for a ponytail hanging down the back. Between the ponytail and the neck is a small hole which was carved, doubtless to hold a cord to suspend it about the neck. The back of the figure is inscribed, "The Osiris who is in Thebes, Occupant Khonsu, true of voice, son of Bes and Mut, true of voice." This is a most unusual little statuette, for it clearly was made to serve as an amulet. This would have been made after his death to serve as something like we see today with the St. Christopher medallions or figures of other saints or even crucifixes worn by the faithful. It is now generally believed that a cult of Occupant Khonsu developed in Thebes after his death. It seems that his influence was such that he was revered not only in life, but after death as a godlike man. In order to discover exactly who Occupant Khonsu was, we really need to start by discussing his mother and his father, the family that brought him into this world. We do have a bit of historical data, which I will discuss in a few moments. But first, we should also note that Crowley discussed this matter himself in his own unique fashion. When Crowley published the Equinox Volume 1, Number 7 in 1912 EV, he included a fictional account of the birth and life of Occupant Khonsu that was entitled Across the Gulf. This work is numbered Liber 59 in the AA curriculum, and it's in Class C, works that are to be considered suggestive more than anything. In the Equinox Volume 1, Number 10, Crowley listed the numbers for the various books in the curriculum, explaining why he assigned that particular number, but he does not offer an explanation for the number 59 or why it was assigned to Across the Gulf. In the listing of the curriculum of AA, the description of Across the Gulf reads, quote, "A fantastic account of a previous incarnation," end quote. In this particular case, the word fantastic should be understood by means of its archaic definition: imaginative and far removed from reality. And here I'm being polite. If it were up to me, I would describe it as a fictional fantasy, completely fictional fantasy of a previous incarnation. Strong words, and why do I say that? Well, let's take a look at the first page of this work, paragraph 2. Crowley wrote, "Therefore, with faith and confidence, do I, who was, in a certain mystical sense, the priest of the princes Akaf and Khonsu, child of Tanek, the holy and mighty one, and Besnamat, priestess of the starry one," end quote. He declares Besnamat to be the female, the priestess of the starry one, by which he meant a priestess of Nuit. Tanek in turn is called the holy and mighty one. He thought that Tanek was the father of Akaf and Khonsu, and he had it completely wrong. Besnamat, as he spelled the name, was his father of Akaf and Khonsu, not his mother. His mother was Tanek. Even though the content of Across the Gulf is fiction, again, to be as blunt as I can possibly be, I consider it misleading and worthless. And with faith and confidence, I think Besnamat might agree with me. The Stèle tells us in the last line of the obverse side that Akaf and Khonsu's mother was the musician of Amun-Ra, lady of the house, Taneshi. As a musician in the temple of Amun-Ra, she played the sistrum. It's completely amazing to me that Aleister Crowley got the parentage of Akaf and Khonsu so wrong. The French translation of the Stèle that he personally commissioned described Akaf and Khonsu as, quote, son of the priestess musician of Amun-Ra, mistress of the house, Tanek. It makes me wonder if he ever bothered to read it. My colleague Frater H.B. said that given the character of the Book of the Law, Crowley manifested a lifelong disregard for Egyptology that is striking. He never seriously studied the subject, end quote. As for Taneshi herself, whom in Crowley's day they used the term Tanek, as for Taneshi herself, we do not possess her coffin or a funerary papyrus for this good lady. But if such a papyrus existed once upon a time, it would doubtlessly have included a vignette of Taneshi like the one depicted on this slide. Her name was defined by Egyptologist Herman Rank in his dictionary, Egyptian Personal Names, to mean hairdresser. Literally, it means comber of the hair. That's what Neshi means, to comb. We find her name written 4 different ways. One way on the Stèle, and 3 more on the bottom sarcophagus of Akaf and Khonsu. The first way is on the Stèle, Taneshi. Students that know anything about Egyptian hieroglyphics will recognize that in her name, the positions of the phonetic T and A are switched. This is called a graphic transposition. The Egyptians often didn't like the way that a small hieroglyph looked next to a bigger one, so they switched their positions. And so that's what's happened in these hieroglyphs, but it has no effect on the order in which we transliterate the letters. The phonetic T actually precedes the phonetic. The hieroglyphs are written exactly backwards. The second way that it's found is on the sarcophagus of her son. This is written Tanesha with the final T ending. The final T would not have been pronounced. This merely identifies the word as a feminine noun. So sometimes we find it actually omitted from the spelling. This variant spelling doesn't mean that it was pronounced any differently than the one above it. The third way is also found on the bottom sarcophagus of Akaf and Khonsu, and it's written Taneshi like the spelling we find on the Stèle, but with the final T ending. The final way we find it written, again from the sarcophagus, is most unusual. It's written Dineshi. The direct article ta is replaced with the verb be, which is the glyph of a hand and arm holding a bread mold. As a standalone verb, it means to give, to put, to place. Here it seems to be a play on words, with the meaning to use the comb, or something along those lines. One must admit that this is an odd name to give a baby, and I doubt anyone was prophesying that her profession as an adult would be a hairstylist. I've always believed that her name suggests that she was born with a lot of hair and nothing else. In the paraphrase from the Stèle that's found in chapter 3 of the Book of the Law, Crowley had written her name as Ta Nek, and had written the name of the father as Bessin. These transliterations were based on the French translation of the Stèle, executed by Georges Darcet, the assistant curator of the Museum of Egyptian Antiquities. Ta-Neshi was born into nobility. From the sarcophagus of Akhaf and Khonsu in the Cairo Museum, catalog 41001, we learn of her father and her grandfather. The inscription on the coffin says that Akhaf and Khonsu was the son of the prophet of Amun in Karnak, and his mother, woman and lady of the house, sister-bearer of Amun-Ra, Ta-Neshi, daughter of the gods father of Amun-Ra, king of the gods, Hahat, true of voice. We know that her father was dead by this time because his name is appended with the epithet for the honored dead, true of voice. So we see that her father was a priest also, who bore the title God's father of Amun-Ra, a title also borne by Akhaf and Khonsu and his father Bessin. Now, a priest who was a God's father was one who had attained to the level of prophet, but had not yet been ordained. The inscription continues and tells us that Hahat himself was the son of the god's father of Amun-Ra, king of the gods Pinpe, true of voice. But from this we can easily deduce that she was well prepared to be the wife of a priest of the Amun temple. She grew up in a family of noble priests. Her father Hahat I was a priest, and so was her paternal grandfather Pinpe. And according to tradition, she would have been trained as a musician in the temple of Amun-Ra, no doubt like her mother before her. Unfortunately, we have no data that tells us anything about her mother or maternal grandparents. The father of Akhaf and Khonsu was Bessin I, a powerful and influential member of the priesthood of Thebes. He founded a dynasty of priests who were in turn prophets of Menthu and servants of the gods in the temple of Amun-Ra, who held a variety of offices during their career. This beautiful statue of Bessin resides in the Louvre Museum in Paris, France. It's a gorgeous piece of artwork, and the great skill and artistry it demonstrates is a testament to the greatness of his reputation and the reverence in which he was held. The carving from the neck down was intended to represent a delicate linen fabric draped over the body of Bessin, with ever so slight impressions of his arms, knees, legs, and feet as he lay in repose. The subtlety and grace of this carving is rare and beautiful. His face is not depicted as the old man he was when he died, but rather as the young, vibrant man who was to be the father of several generations of holy men and women. The spelling of Bessin's name occurs on the Stèle of Revealing as well as on the outer and inner sarcophagi and the outer and inner coffins of Akhaf and Khonsu. Most Thelemites are only familiar with the form as it's written on the Stèle. There, it's written like this. There's nothing unusual about it except due for space consideration, the determinative of the seated noble is missing. On the coffin of Akhaf and Khonsu, we find his father's name written thusly. It's a little different, using the glyph of a human leg for the phonetic B instead of the ba bird, and using the glyph of folded cloth for a phonetic S instead of the glyph of the jar lid as an example. As in the example of the Stèle Revealing, the determinative of the seated noble is missing. The third variation in the spelling of the name of Bessin is found on the coffin of Akhaf and Khonsu's eldest son, Nesser Amen. This form is a bit unusual, but it becomes more common as years pass. The form is identical to variants 1 and 2, except it introduces the glyph of the cowhide and tail for unknown reasons. Sorry about that. Let me back up one. The final form of his name is pronounced Bethiu and Mut, and we really don't know why. The Stèle revealing itself doesn't tell us very much about who Onkefikansu was in respect to his temple duties. It only gives us 3 of the titles he assumed. And on the Stèle, here are the 3 titles mentioned: Prophet of Menthu, Lord of Thebes, Opener of the Doors of Heaven in Karnak, Stolist of Thebes. The term prophet was the word used by the Greeks to translate the Egyptian term, which was Hem-Nether, which means literally God's servant. It was a very high priestly category, for those priests functioned in a cult service and to a statue of the god in the heart of the temple. They were also capable of interpreting the oracles of the god, hence the Greeks called them prophets. This same priest was called Opener of the Doors in Heaven, because it was he who daily entered the Holy of Holies of the temple and literally opened the doors to the shrine of the god statue. He would have also been called the Stolist priest, which means the clother of the god. They would provide daily sacrifice to the statue of the god, clothe the statue, and in the evening seal the inner chamber of the Holy of Holies. This was a very sacred duty, as very few were even allowed to view the statue in the Holy of Holies, let alone touch it. But my friends, this is only beginning of what you know about Onkefikansu. By examining the inscriptions upon his funerary remains, I have identified and translated another 20 titles he was given, as well as an epithet given to the honored dead. And another Egyptologist found another 3 titles in the Book of the Dead belonging to Onkefikansu that is yet unpublished. Number 1 title of Onkefikansu that we don't know, well, we do now, Beloved of the God, which is a shortened form of the title God's Father, Beloved of the God. A variant of this title is Beloved of the God in Karnak. The 4th title he possessed was Wind Priest, a somewhat obscure designation. The title occurs frequently after the 22nd dynasty, but we know very little about the office. In addition to Stolist, or clother of the god, he was specifically called Stolist of Kamutef, which means Stolist of the bull of his mother. In this context, bull of his mother was an epithet of Amun-Ra. He was the clother of the statue of Amun-Ra in the Holy of Holies. He was also a prophet of libation and a libation priest of Kansu in the midst of the Bin-Bin. The Bin-Bin was a pyramidal-shaped stone in Heliopolis that celebrated the birth of the sun god Ra. Thebes was called the Heliopolis of the South, and this particular Bin-Bin stone was probably in Thebes. He was also called libation priest in the Sokar festival, one of the most important and popular festivals in Thebes, led by the pharaoh himself. The bark of Sokar was carried by 16 priests, preceded by the libation priest, who it was said, quote, purifies the way of the god with incense and libations before the majesty of the god, end quote. He was the embracer of the Wijat eye, that is the sacred uninjured eye of Horus, a symbol that represented healing and rebirth. An extension of this title was embracer of the Wijat eye for Mut, Lady of Heaven. The sacred triad of gods in Thebes was Amun-Ra, his wife Mut, and their son Kansu. The titles of Onkefikansu show us that he was in sacred duty to all of them. Hence, he was called prophet and embracer of the Wijat eye. As prophet, he was the voice of the god, here in relation to the goddess Mut, as embracer or protector of the sacred eye. He was also called prophet of the bull of the Ennead, another name for Amun-Ra. He was the prophet of Osiris, presider over the House of Gold. The House of Gold was a name given to the chamber that held the sarcophagus of the king, hence the inclusion of the name Osiris, god of the dead. Prophet of Mentu, lord of the thrones of the two lands, identified him as the voice of Mentu, lord of all of Egypt. Then we see a number of titles that define his priestly service in Thebes. Lord of the Holy Land, prophet of Mentu, lord of Thebes, wanted his monthly service for the Amun Temple, second file. This title was given to one after his death. We know that because Lord of the Holy Land is not a title, but it's an epithet for the deceased, meaning Lord of the Duat or the afterlife. The remainder describe his monthly duty in the Temple of Amun. A file was a group of priests, each serving one lunar month. There were 4 files, so each file would serve 3 months, with 3 months off between service. Akhenaten Khonsu was leader of the file, or more fully, leader of the file in the second file. He was also leader of the file of the Ra Temple from the roof of the Amun Temple in the second file, another duty of each file. Sometimes he was referred to simply as one in his monthly service of the Amun Temple, a term that applied to any priest of any file. We see it clarified in one in his monthly service of the Amun Temple second file, or monthly, a little more elaborately, in monthly attendant of the Amun Temple in the second file, and even more elaborately, monthly attendant of the Amun Temple in the midst of Karnak in the second file. And lastly, his title, Prophet of Mentu, Lord of Thebes, Akhenaten Khonsu, leader of the file, presiding over the House of Gold in the midst of the mound of Mut. The Mut precinct lay approximately 100 yards south of the Amun Temple at Karnak. And finally, Beneficent Ba, the follower of the city god. It's not a title, it's an honorific epithet of the deceased that I found on the sarcophagus of Akhenaten Khonsu. In this case, it was written immediately following his title, Stolist of Thebes. From all of these, I think we can easily determine that Akhenaten Khonsu was a prominent and very important figure in Thebes. The stellar revealing tells us also in the last line of the verse side that Akhenaten Khonsu was Saminu Besenmut, which means son of the man with the same titles, Besenmut. In other words, he bore the same titles that his father did in the Temple of Amun-Ra. It was customary that sons of priests would be brought up training in the temple, and they would eventually take their father's place in the hierarchy. At this point, let's take a 15-minute break so everyone can freshen up. And when we return, I'll introduce the family of Akhenaten Khonsu, and I'll translate the stellar revealing for you.